I was a federal judge on my way home from the courthouse, but a routine traffic stop spiraled into a deadly game of survival when I realized the officer didn't want my license. He wanted the evidence that could destroy the city's most dangerous organized scheme. I had one chance to expose the truth before I was silenced forever. But as the sirens grew closer, I realized the hunt was only just beginning. The rain in this city has a way of turning the asphalt into a mirror, reflecting the neon chaos of the night. I was driving my sedan home, exhausted after a 16-hour shift at the courthouse, my mind still cluttered with the messy details of a federal sentencing hearing. I just wanted my couch, a glass of wine, and the sweet silence of my own living room. Then, the flashing blue and red lights appeared in my rearview mirror, slicing through the heavy downpour like a headache. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands steady on the steering wheel. I had nothing to hide, but there was a sharp, familiar tension in my stomach, the kind I'd spent my entire career trying to look past in my courtroom. I watched through the rain-slicked window as the officer approached. He didn't seem to be in any hurry. His boots splashed deep into the puddle beside my door, and he shone his flashlight directly into my eyes before even asking for my documents. I blinked, shielded my gaze, and rolled down the window just enough to be heard. "Evening, officer," I said, keeping my voice cool and professional. "Is there a problem?" He didn't answer right away. He leaned in, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat, and peered into the back seat of my car, then back at me. "License and registration, and keep your hands where I can see them," he commanded, his tone dripping with an unearned authority that grated on my nerves. I reached slowly into my purse, pulled out my wallet, and handed him my documents. As he flipped through them, his eyes lingered on my driver's license, then flicked up to my face. He didn't acknowledge my credentials. Instead, he made a show of looking around the interior of my car again, his expression tightening into something defensive, even aggressive. "This car looks suspicious," he muttered, almost to himself. "You know, we've been getting reports about a local network running a transit scheme through this sector. You wouldn't happen to have any illegal weapon or packages with restricted substances in that trunk, would you?" I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Officer, I am a federal judge. I am on my way home from the courthouse. There is absolutely nothing in my trunk except for legal briefs and my work bag." He let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded more like a bark. "A federal judge? That's a good one. You know, I've heard plenty of stories, but that's a new level of entitlement. Step out of the vehicle. Now." "I am not stepping out of this vehicle without a valid reason," I said, my voice dropping into the stern, uncompromising cadence I used in my chambers. "You are conducting a baseless stop. I am requesting that you call your supervisor to the scene immediately." The officer's face darkened, his jaw clenching so hard I could see the muscle twitch. He reached for his radio, but instead of calling for a superior, he leaned even closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low growl. "You want a supervisor? Fine. But while we wait, I think I have reasonable suspicion to believe this vehicle is part of a larger operation. I'm going to search it, and if I find even a hint of contraband, or if I decide that you're resisting arrest, you're going to be looking at a serious charge, maybe even a life-altering sentence in a cage." I felt the blood drain from my face. He wasn't just being power-hungry. He was genuinely escalating the situation into something malicious. He reached for the handle of my car door, his grip tight, ready to force it open. "Wait," I said, reaching for my glove compartment. "I need to show you something that will make you rethink your entire career path tonight." As I clicked the latch, his hand went straight to his belt, resting on his holster. "Don't reach for anything. If that's a weapon, you're done." I ignored the threat, my fingers trembling slightly as I pulled out a heavy, embossed leather folder, the one that signified the authority of the United States District Court. I held it up, but as I turned to hand it to him, the officer's flashlight beam caught the reflection of a car pulling up rapidly behind us. It wasn't a patrol cruiser. The headlights were too bright, too aggressive, and as the car slammed to a halt, 3 men in plainclothes stepped out, their hands already moving toward their belts. The officer turned his head, his face pale with a sudden, unreadable panic. He looked at the approaching men, then back at me, and his hand moved with terrifying speed toward the latch of my door, intent on dragging me out before I could utter another word. Just as he yanked the door open, the lead man from the second vehicle shouted a command that stopped the world in its tracks. "Drop the weapon!" the man shouted, his voice cutting through the drumming rain like a razor. My officer froze, his fingers inches from my collar, his body caught in a twisted posture of aggression. He whipped his head around, his eyes wide with a cocktail of confusion and sudden, sharp terror. He hadn't expected backup, at least not the kind that carried the cold, calculated authority of the Internal Security Service. I remained perfectly still, my hand still gripping the embossed folder. I watched the officer's face undergo a grotesque transformation. The arrogance that had fueled his interrogation seconds ago evaporated, replaced by a frantic, sweating desperation. He knew exactly who those men were. He knew that if they were here, the situation had shifted from a simple traffic stop to something that would be scrubbed, analyzed, and punished with extreme prejudice. "Officer Miller," the lead man said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He didn't approach us. He stood by the rear of his vehicle, his hand hovering near his own hip, not quite on his sidearm but ready to draw. "Step away from the judge's vehicle. Now." Miller stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the wet pavement. I had no idea," he stammered, his bravado replaced by a stuttering plea. "There was a report. The vehicle matched a description of a transit vehicle for a suspected network. I was doing my job." The man from the second vehicle walked forward, his eyes never leaving Miller. He ignored the officer's excuses, his gaze sliding past him to meet mine. There was no warmth there, only an acknowledgement of my status, a cold, professional courtesy that felt more like a warning than a rescue. He ignored the officer entirely, focusing solely on the folder I held in my shaking hand. "Your Honor," the man said, tipping his head slightly, "we have been monitoring the tactical frequencies in this sector for the last hour. We have reason to believe this officer has been acting outside of department protocols for quite some time. We've been building a case against him and his cohorts." My breath hitched. "You knew?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You knew he was out here? And you let him pull me over?" The man's eyes flickered, just for a heartbeat, and I saw a flash of something. Regret? No, that was too human. It was calculation. We couldn't risk revealing the investigation prematurely. But when he decided to escalate this into a threat against a federal official, we had no choice but to intervene. Miller, realizing his career, and perhaps his freedom, was evaporating in real time, suddenly lunged toward the open door of my car, reaching for the floorboard. My heart stopped. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was reaching for my phone, which had slid underneath the passenger seat when he'd yanked the door open. He knew that my phone had been recording the entire encounter from the moment he flipped his lights on. "Don't!" I shouted, but Miller was already diving inside, his heavy frame crushing the upholstery. The three men in plainclothes didn't hesitate. They lunged forward, tackling Miller to the wet, oil-slicked road. The sound of his head hitting the pavement was sickening. He struggled, a wild, cornered animal, screaming about conspiracies and setups, but they pinned him with an efficiency that made it clear they had done this 100 times before. I sat in the silence of my car, my lungs burning, watching the man I had sentenced in my mind weeks ago, now being crushed under the weight of his own hubris. One of the men walked over to my window, pulled out a small metallic device, and pressed it against the frame of my door. A faint, high-pitched whine emanated from it. "Your Honor," the man said, looking at me with dead eyes, "you are currently in possession of evidence that is highly classified. We are going to need to confiscate your phone, your dash cam, and everything else in this car that contains a record of what happened here tonight." I stared at him, realization dawning on me with icy clarity. This wasn't a rescue. This was a cover-up. Miller wasn't being arrested for harassing a judge. He was being arrested for being a liability to an even larger, more dangerous machine. "You aren't taking me home," I said, a chill racing down my spine that had nothing to do with the freezing rain. The man pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt, the metal glinting ominously under the streetlights. "Your Honor, you are being brought in for a mandatory safety debriefing. It is for your own protection, of course. We have a lot to discuss regarding what you've stumbled upon, and honestly, We're worried that if you go home tonight, you might not be safe anymore." He leaned in close, his breath fogging the glass. "You see, it's not just the officer. The rabbit hole goes much deeper than you realize. Are you ready to see what's really happening behind the scenes of this city?" He reached for the interior handle to open my door, his eyes searching mine for a sign of resistance. I knew then that if I stepped out of this car, I might never see my home again. I shifted my hand toward the gear shift, my heart racing, as the man noticed my movement and his hand flew to his holster, a warning growl rising in his throat. The metal of the gear shift felt like ice under my palm, but my resolve was burning. I caught the man's eyes, the one with the handcuffs, and for a fraction of a second, I didn't see a federal agent. I saw a man who had long ago traded his soul for the cold, unyielding mechanics of a system that consumed everything in its path. "I'm not going to any debriefing that involves me in handcuffs," I said, my voice steadying. I had spent years commanding rooms full of lawyers, felons, and bailiffs. I knew how to hold my ground. "If you want me to cooperate, you'll put those away and explain exactly which department authorized the surveillance of a sitting federal judge." The man didn't move. He kept the cuffs extended, the steel chains rattling softly in the wind. "You're making a mistake, Judge. You're trying to apply the rule of law to a situation that has already moved beyond it. The street is a different courtroom." Suddenly, a loud, piercing screech of tires echoed from the darkness behind the second vehicle. A black SUV barreled down the road, headlights off, swerving violently to avoid the patrol car. The agents lunged back, their attention momentarily ripped away from me. Miller, who had been pinned to the ground just seconds ago, saw his opening. With a surge of adrenaline, he kicked out, knocking the nearest agent off balance, and scrambled toward the darkness of the nearby tree line. Chaos erupted. One of the agents drew his sidearm, not the standard police issue, but a specialized, suppressed weapon, and opened fire, the shots sounding like rhythmic snaps of dry wood. Miller scrambled, his boots splashing through the mud, disappearing into the thicket of trees that lined the highway. "Forget the judge, get the target!" the leader shouted. The men abandoned their attempt to restrain me, sprinting toward the tree line in pursuit of the rogue officer. I saw my chance. I slammed the car into drive, the engine roaring as I yanked the steering wheel hard to the left. The tires spun, digging into the mud before finding traction on the asphalt, and I sped off, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't look back. I drove until the flashing blue lights were nothing more than a faint, dying flicker in my rearview mirror. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the wheel. I reached into my purse for my phone, only to realize it was gone. Miller must have swiped it during the struggle in the car. I was alone, miles from home, and in possession of absolutely nothing that could prove what had just happened. I drove for an hour, taking back roads, my instincts screaming at me not to return to my apartment. I knew that if the people who had been monitoring the situation were as powerful as they seemed, my home would be the first place they'd go. I needed a sanctuary, someone who operated outside the reach of the Internal Security Service. I thought of Elias, a former public defender who had been disbarred a year ago after trying to whistleblow on a massive transit scheme involving, irony of ironies, the very same department that had just tried to debrief me. I pulled into a dimly lit motel on the edge of the city, checking in under a false name with the last of my cash. I locked the deadbolt, pushed a heavy dresser against the door, and sank onto the edge of the mattress. My reflection in the grimy mirror above the vanity showed a woman I barely recognized, disheveled, terrified, but alive. I reached into my coat pocket to grab a tissue, and my fingers brushed against something hard and cold. I pulled it out. It was a thumb drive, silver and small, that had been tucked into the lining of my purse for months. A backup I had forgotten about, containing encrypted documents from a high-profile case involving local government corruption. I had kept it as a precaution, a just-in-case insurance policy. I turned on the small, flickering motel television to clear my mind, but my blood went cold immediately. Every news channel was running a breaking story. A video was playing on the screen, the dash cam footage from Miller's car. It was clearly edited. The video showed me, the judge, reaching for a weapon in my glove compartment. It showed me resisting arrest. It showed me assaulting the officer. The anchor's voice was grim, reporting that a federal judge had been apprehended after a violent confrontation involving an illegal stash of prohibited substances and a dangerous weapon. "She is currently considered a fugitive," the anchor said, a photo of my own face plastered on the screen. "Authorities warn that she is armed and should be considered highly dangerous." My breath caught in my throat. They hadn't just covered up the incident, they had rewritten the reality of it. I stood up, backing away from the television as if it were a bomb. There was a soft, rhythmic thudding coming from the other side of my door. Not a knock, a deliberate, heavy test of the lock. "Judge?" a voice whispered from the hallway. It wasn't one of the agents. It was a voice I knew. It was my clerk, Sarah, but she sounded different, broken, trembling. "Judge, please open the door. They told me if I didn't get you to come out, they'd never let my family go." I stared at the door, paralyzed. If I opened it, I was walking into a trap. If I stayed silent, my clerk would pay the price for my survival. The pounding on the door intensified, and I realized with a sickening thud that I wasn't just being hunted, I was being baited. And just as I reached for the door handle to make a choice, the power in the entire motel cut out, plunging me into absolute, suffocating darkness. The silence that followed the power cut was heavy, suffocating. I stood in the absolute dark of the motel room, my lungs burning as I thought to control my breathing. Through the thin walls, I heard the faint, distorted sound of traffic outside. But inside, the air felt thick, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I kept my hand on the cold steel of the door handle, but I didn't turn it. My mind was racing, trying to reconcile the voice of my clerk, Sarah, with the lethal reality of the men who were hunting me. "Sarah?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "If that's really you, tell me the name of the cat I rescued last winter." There was a long, painful pause. Outside, the rain tapped rhythmically against the glass, sounding like fingers drumming on a coffin lid. Finally, she replied, her voice trembling so violently it was hard to make out the words. "His name is Justice, Judge. Please, they're right behind me in the hallway. I can't keep them waiting anymore." My heart shattered. I knew that voice. It was Sarah, but the background noise, the metallic scrape of a heavy object against the carpet, the lack of any other footsteps, told me she wasn't alone. She was being coerced, likely being fed lines by someone standing just out of sight. I needed to move, but the room was a trap, and the hallway was a kill box. I turned away from the door and moved toward the bathroom, my movements practiced and silent. I knew this was the end of my life as I had known it. The career, the status, the clean sheets and the quiet home. It was all gone. I pulled the thumb drive from my pocket, realizing that this small piece of silver was the reason they were willing to tear the city apart to find me. It wasn't just corruption. It was a blueprint of a network that reached into the highest chambers of the government. I slipped out of the bathroom window, the cold night air biting at my skin. I dropped into the mud behind the motel, landing in a crouch. The alleyway was narrow and smelled of damp trash and rot. I could see the glow of flashlights dancing against the brick wall of the main building. They were searching room by room, methodically, like a virus spreading through a host. I began to crawl toward the back parking lot, keeping low, my pulse drumming in my ears. I had to reach the main road, but I knew the area would be swarming with patrols disguised as civilian vehicles. I had to be smarter. I had to be a ghost. As I reached the end of the alley, a sedan pulled up to the curb, its headlights doused. The door swung open. A man stepped out, tall, wearing a heavy trench coat, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. He didn't look like an agent. He looked like a shadow. "Get in," he said, his voice deep and raspy. I froze, hovering in the darkness between two dumpsters. "Who are you?" "I'm the person who told you to keep that drive safe 6 months ago," he replied, not turning his head. "I'm the reason you haven't been caught yet. Now get in before the internal security teams clear the parking lot." I hesitated for only a second, then lunged for the car. I threw myself into the passenger seat, the smell of stale coffee and gunpowder hitting me instantly. He slammed the car into gear, and we roared away from the motel just as the front door of my room splintered inward. I looked back and saw the flashlight swarming the space I had occupied just moments before. "They're going to kill her," I said, my voice tight with rage. "Sarah, they're going to hurt her because I didn't come out." "They were going to hurt her regardless of what you did," the man said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "She was the weakest link, and you were the prize. You're not just a judge anymore. You're a liability to the most powerful organized scheme in this state. They aren't going to arrest you, Your Honor. They're going to erase you." He turned onto a highway, accelerating until the engine whined. "We have to get you to a secure site. But before that, we need to know what's on that drive. If it's what I think it is, we don't just have a case, we have a war." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the drive, holding it up. "What is this, really?" He glanced at me, and for the first time he smiled, a humorless, jagged expression. "It's the list. The names of every judge, every prosecutor, and every high-ranking official who has been on the payroll of this network for the last decade. It's the end of the current regime." Suddenly, the car swerved violently. A black SUV slammed into our rear bumper, the force nearly spinning us into the median. The man grabbed the steering wheel, fighting to keep us on the road as more vehicles appeared, boxing us in from all sides. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy object, handing it to me. It wasn't a badge. It was a heavy, modified firearm. "Use it," he shouted over the screeching tires. "They aren't here to talk anymore." I gripped the heavy weapon, my knuckles white. As another impact jarred the car, the passenger window shattered inward, glass spraying across the dashboard. A man in black tactical gear was leaning out of the side of the chasing SUV, his weapon leveled directly at my chest. I didn't think. I didn't judge. I pulled the trigger, and as the kickback rattled my bones, I saw the tactical gear man crumple, but the car spun out of control, heading straight toward the edge of a bridge. As we tipped over the side, time seemed to slow, and I watched, paralyzed, as the barrier crumbled beneath us. The sensation of weightlessness lasted only a heartbeat before the world exploded in a cacophony of screeching metal and shattering glass. The car slammed into the shallow riverbed below, the impact throwing me against the airbag with enough force to steal the breath from my lungs. Everything went black for a moment, the silence of the night replaced by the ringing in my ears and the sound of the engine hissing against the cold water. I struggled to regain consciousness, my vision swimming in shades of gray. The car was partially submerged, water seeping in through the shattered windshield. I looked over at the driver, the man who had claimed to be my ally, but he was slumped against the steering wheel, motionless. Panic flared in my chest, hot and sharp. I kicked at the passenger door, my legs shaking, until the frame finally buckled outward. I tumbled into the freezing current, gasping, and crawled toward the muddy bank, the thumb drive clutched so tightly in my hand that my skin had turned white around the edges. I didn't stop until I reached the cover of the dense woods along the river. I collapsed behind a fallen oak, shivering uncontrollably. The sirens were everywhere now, a cacophony of police, fire, and emergency vehicles converging on the bridge above. I could hear their radios, the distorted voices of the hunters, shouting orders to drag the river. They weren't looking for survivors. They were looking for the drive. I looked at the silver object in my hand. This was the catalyst for an entire system's collapse, but it was also a death warrant. I realized then that I couldn't run forever. If I tried to hide, they would burn the world down to find me, and people like Sarah would continue to be used as pawns. I checked my coat pocket. My phone was gone, but I had a backup plan I'd prepared months ago, tucked into my purse's secret compartment. A satellite uplink that bypassed standard cellular towers. I activated it, my fingers moving with a precision born of survival. I didn't go to the local authorities. I didn't go to the Internal Security Service. I sent the files directly to 3 different major news networks and the office of the Attorney General, setting a timed trigger that would release the encryption key if I didn't cancel the countdown every 6 hours. I waited in the woods as the dawn light began to bleed through the trees, painting the world in pale, sickly shades of violet. The search parties were getting closer, the beams of their high-powered flashlights slicing through the mist. I knew I couldn't outrun them, but I didn't need to. I pulled my coat tight and walked toward the clearing where the main road intersected with the highway. I stepped out onto the asphalt just as a convoy of unmarked vehicles rounded the corner. I stood there, hands raised, the thumb drive held clearly between my fingers. The cars skidded to a halt, and a dozen men in tactical gear swarmed out, weapons raised. Among them was the man who had confronted me at the motel, his face twisted in a mask of triumph. "It's over, Judge," he sneered, approaching me with his weapon leveled. "Hand it over, and maybe we can discuss a quiet exit." I smiled, a cold, sharp expression that finally felt like my own. "It's already gone," I said, "and the world is already watching. Look at your phones, gentlemen. It's all live." The leader paused, his thumb hovering over his radio. He glanced down at his device, then at his men. One by one, the other agents began checking their screens, their faces shifting from predatory confidence to utter, pale horror. The evidence of their network, the bank statements, the recorded conversations, the list of names, was being uploaded to every major server in the country. The organized scheme that had felt untouchable was being dismantled in real time, one digital upload at a time. He lunged for me, reaching for my throat, but the sound of distant rotors filled the air. A fleet of state police helicopters and federal agents from an entirely different jurisdiction, the real ones, descended upon the scene. The corrupt agents, realizing their world had collapsed, dropped their weapons, their eyes darting around in a futile search for an escape that no longer existed. The arrest that followed was poetic. I was placed in the back of a cruiser, not as a criminal, but as a protected witness. I watched through the window as they handcuffed the man who had tried to erase me, his face a portrait of the same fear he had tried to force upon me. Months later, the courtroom was silent as I sat in the gallery, no longer wearing the robes of a judge, but observing the final sentencing of the men who had once controlled the city. The trial was the largest of its kind in history, a systemic cleansing that tore the rot out of the foundation of our government. As the gavel fell, a sound I had once made myself, I felt the weight finally lift from my shoulders. Justice, the cat I had rescued, sat curled on my lap at home that evening, purring against the silence. I had lost my position, my anonymity, and my old life, but as I looked out at the city skyline, I realized I had gained something far more valuable: a clean conscience in a world where the truth finally had a seat at the table. The nightmare was over, and for the first time in my life, the law was actually working for the people it was meant to protect.